Hey guys, Trevor Alexander here with Burn Saddlery. I've been a saddle maker for about 9 years now, and today I'm going to teach you how to put an inlay in a saddle just like this one. Now that we have all of our excess trimmed off and everything's fit up tight, we're going to go ahead and create an inlay shape that works for you in your saddle. So now you're going to take your supplied pattern and you're going to trace it onto a scrap piece of Chap leather. Keep in mind, this is not the piece of Chap leather that you're going to be using for your actual inlay. So we're going to go ahead and trace our supplied pattern onto some Chap leather. With that traced out, we're going to go ahead and cut it out. I'm just going to use some scissors. So the first thing that we're going to do before we get our inlay piece into the saddle is we're going to figure out where our cantle pinch line is. So I'm going to be pinching the back of the cantle and butting up these cantle pliers with the back of the cantle, just like that. So that mimics the line that we have underneath. I'm going to do this on both sides, and this will help me line up my inlay and keep it center. All right, so now that we have our pinch lines, we're going to go ahead and take our inlay piece and we're going to set it in so that the widest point here is running up onto the cantle. What I mean by that is I'm imagining a center line that goes across this, and I want the highest part here just a little bit above, like an inch above that center line. Just like that. Once I feel like everything's nice and centered and straight, from here to here is centered, then we're going to go ahead and trace this line in. And as many of you know, it can be kind of a pain to trace out something that's cut out of Chap leather. So after you do this inlay, save this bottom piece and you can use that for your next inlay pattern. And it'll just make tracing things a little easier and make the next one you do a little nicer. All right, now that everything's traced out, we're going to go ahead and take the screws out of it, and we're going to cut this inlay piece out on the table. I want to flatten it enough that I can cut it, but not flatten it so much that it distorts the leather away from its shape. Just enough that I can get connection with the table all the way around. So while you're cutting this out, make sure your knife stays at a 90-degree angle from your leather so you're not under or over cutting. And just be really careful when you get to these corners up here. I like to cut in a little ways there and then come from the other way so I don't slip out of that corner. Okay, and like I said, now that you have this piece, I would save it for your next inlay. So now that the inlay's cut out, we're going to put the seat back in the saddle, making sure we line up all the screw holes that we had before. All right, now that our seat is installed in our saddle, we're going to go ahead and get our inlay foam. This is 3/8 inch foam. It's pretty dense stuff. You don't want anything that's too squishy or else it'll just flatten out as soon as you sit in it. And we're going to get a chunk of foam that's just a little bit bigger than the inlay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this chalk and I'm going to go right along the edge of that cut. Just like that. I'm going to take my piece of foam and I'm going to set it over the top so everything covers, making sure not to move anything at this point. It's all got to stay nice and firm and stable. I'm going to just press down and that chalk line will show up on my inlay and give me a nice pattern I can follow. So now we have our chalk line traced on our foam and we're going to cut along the chalk line, making sure to keep the knife at a 90-degree angle. And with this, I'd rather be just a little bit on the outside of the chalk than on the inside, because it can always compress in a little bit, but it's kind of hard to stretch it and get it to fit if it's cut too small. All right, now that we have our foam cut, we're gonna take a piece of skirting leather. This is about 2 ounce. We're gonna set it on here, and we're gonna trace out 3/4 of an inch all around it. We're going to cut this piece out. So now we have our skirting leather piece cut. Now we're going to cut our Chap hide piece. We'll set that off to the side. We're going to cut our Chap hide 1 inch bigger than the foam. So we'll set our wing dividers to 1 inch. And make sure when you're doing this, you don't scratch up your Chap hide where it'll be seen. We're going to cut that out. So we've got all of our pieces cut now. We're going to take our skirting leather and our Chap hide, and we're going to feather the edge down to nothing. We'll give it a nice skive. Before we do that, we're going to wet both pieces down. Just spray them down, a little bit of water. Like I said, we don't want to get them too wet or else our glue won't stick very well. But if we wet them down just a little bit, then the leather will mold a little bit better. And with Chap hide, you can wet down the rough outside, and if you kind of pat it down, then that water will soak into the Chap hide a little bit better. Okay, now we're going to skive. Nice thin skive out to nothing. So the reason that we're doing this skive is to make it so that there's no lump when we put the leather underneath the seat, because we're going to be adding 2 thicknesses of leather underneath the seat. So if we don't skive it out, there will be a lump underneath the seat. All right, we're going to skive our skirting leather piece now. Same skive we did on the Chap hide piece. Now we're going to move back to the saddle with our 3 pieces and get them installed. So we're going to be tracing on the ground seat on the inside of where our inlay's at, and I'll show you how to do that. So you just come around here, around where the inlay's at. So now that we have that all traced out, we're going to remove the seat, set it aside, and install our skirting leather piece. We're going to make sure we cover that entire pin line we just made, making sure everything looks even all the way around it. Mold that in the best you can. Then we're going to put 2 nails, 1 in each corner. All right, now that we have our nails in, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our seat. Make sure we're covering everywhere that we need to. We're not going to put our screws in the seat right now. We're just making sure everything covers the way it should. So everything looks good here. I'm going to pop this back out. And now we are going to glue our skirting leather piece and our foam. We have quite a bit of glue on here, so we'll just spread it out nice and thin. Now we're going to glue our foam, making sure to glue the side that we traced the chalk on. Well, that's all glued, and before our glue sets up too much, we're going to set our seat back into where it was. This time we are going to be putting all the screws in, getting it installed where it should be. Then we're just going to press everything in, make sure we don't have any bubbles anywhere around the inlay area. Okay, now we're to that point, we're going to let our glue set up and be right back. All right, our glue's all set up, so we're gonna go ahead and install the foam in the seat. So I'm gonna kind of fold it in half, and then I'm gonna start in the front. I'm gonna press this foam into the seat so that there's no gaps anywhere. I'm gonna go to my corner, make sure my corner's lined up real good. I'm gonna have a gap right here, so I'm gonna eliminate that gap before I go. Okay, now that our foam is installed, we're gonna go ahead and pull the seat out again. Now we're gonna glue our Chap leather piece and our foam. While we're gluing our foam, we wanna make sure we get a thin layer of glue on our leather so that it will stick to the leather. Okay, we'll let that glue set up for about 5 minutes and we'll go back and stick it. All right, now we're ready to stick our Chap hide on here. I'm gonna start about right there, about in the middle-ish. Let's just roll it onto the top and get the whole top part stuck. Now that the top part is stuck, I'm gonna bend it into the crease here. So I don't want this outside to stick quite yet. So I'm just gonna bend that leather to get it into the crease. After the leather has been creased into the corner, then it's just fine if the outside sticks. So now that all that's done, we're gonna grab a tickler, run this leather into the crease all the way around, and make sure we have a nice corner. Honestly, the options for an inlay are endless. You could have a piece of skirting leather that's tooled to match your saddle. There is countless exotic leathers. Anything that you can get to mold around this piece of foam will work just great for an inlay. Now we're gonna prep our seat for our inlay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna flip it over. And this is where we're gonna use all of our tools. So we're going to be using a French edger to go around this outside. We're gonna need our stitch groover, both styles, and then we're gonna need an edger, and then tools to edge and burnish. So let's start with our French edger. This is a number 10 French edger from Ron's. And I'm going to be taking about half of the thickness away from this particular piece of leather. But the idea behind it is to take enough thickness away is so that your inlay sits a little bit higher than your seat when everything's done. Now I'm just going to taper this out so there's no lumps. It just goes right into that skive. Okay, now that we have that skived, we're going to take our edger. This is a Berry King 0 round bottom edger. We're going to edge off this bottom side just so it'll tuck into the inlay a little nicer. Now we're going to move on to the top side. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch groove the top side. This groove is about 3/16 wide, and then using the push stitch groover, I'm going to make a point here, just like that, just as if it would have been able to continue making it into there. Now that everything's stitch grooved, we're going to take our number 0 round bottom edger again and go all the way around the top. And for the top piece, you want a relatively small edger, because if you have a large edger, it will make it look like your seat is gapping, and you don't want that. Okay, so now we're going to burnish and dye this portion here. And this burnish rag has a little bit of wax on it, not very much, and it's just soaked with dye after years of use. And it's just canvas. Now we're just going to take our dye pen. Make sure you get those corners in good. Then we'll burnish it one last time. Now we're ready to flip this over. And we're going to glue this skived portion. We're about an inch away from the edge. Okay, with that glued, we're going to go over to the saddle and glue around the inlay. So when gluing around the inlay, it's important to just take a little caution. Make sure you don't get any glue up on the inlay piece itself. If it's on this flat edge here, it will show. So I'm going to try and stay just a little bit of ways. And if I have to, I can come in with my finger and spread a little glue too. It can be a little bit more precise. All right, now that everything is glued, we're going to go ahead and stick the seat to the inlay. I'm going to take this. I'm going to start in my corner here and work away over to my other corner. I'm going to have to compress this leather in right here. So the hardest part about making an inlay work correctly is just the nature of leather wants to grow and shrink as it gets wet and dries out. So trying to keep all of your tolerances right, trying to keep the gaps out can be challenging, especially if you're inlaying skirting into skirting. It can be challenging. You can have everything nice and clean, no gaps, and then as soon as it dries, it gaps in places. Now that all that's stuck, we're going to take our hammer, we're going to tap around the edge. So now that all that's tapped in, we're going to pop the seat and the inlay out, take it over to the sewing machine and sew around it. So when I'm popping the leather out, I'm going to get my hand right up next to that nail and I'm going to just pull it through the leather or out of the tree. That time it pulled through the leather, just like that. Go to the other side and do the same thing. Okay, they both pulled through the leather. Okay, now we'll take it over to the sewing machine and sew it up. Okay, so we're gonna start on the off side of the saddle because that side gets the least attention and it's gonna be less obvious to see where you stopped and started on the off side of the saddle. Make sure we start right in our point here. And then you want to match the stitch length with the stitches on your saddle so that all of the stitches on the saddle are the same length. And again, we're using 277 top thread and 207 for the bobbin thread. And at this point, you might be seeing some gaps opening up in your inlay. Don't worry about those, they will close up. It'll be okay. So these tracks that are left by the sewing machine are going to be something that we're going to need to rub out of the leather. What we'll do is we'll just wet the leather down and the tracks from the sewing machine will come right out. Okay, pull this out. And then I'm going to pull my top thread through so I have all 4 ends on the bottom side. And then I'll tie these ends together and I'll actually glue them underneath the seat so that they can't come loose. So now our seat is sewn around the edge of the inlay and it's tied off on the bottom. So now we're going to edge and burnish around the outside of our seat and we should be ready for install. I'm using a number 0 Berry King round bottom edger like I was before. So I'm going to add just a little bit more water to this edge because it's dried out just a little bit. Then we'll burnish the edge and then we'll dye it and burnish it again. And burnishing the edge just smooths those fibers down. And I like to burnish it before I dye it because it helps my dye pen last a little bit longer. Everything's edged and burnished now. So now we're going to go ahead and install the seat. So the seat's dried out quite a bit, so we're going to add just a little bit of water to it. Okay, now that everything's wet down, we're going to take our scratcher and we're going to scratch up the smooth surfaces of the leather. The inlay portion is rough out, so we don't have to scratch that. It will stick just fine. But all this smooth around here, we'll need to scratch that. Okay. So now that we have our seat glued, we're going to go over to the saddle. And before we glue the saddle, we're going to make sure that these nails aren't sticking up. So we're going to tap them in. All right, before our glue sets up, we're going to go ahead and get our seat set in, lining everything up like we have every other time, making sure all of our screw holes are lined up. And we're gonna throw our drawdown strap over and get everything compressed in. So now everything's strapped down good and tight. So we're gonna wait 5 minutes for our glue to set up, and then we will stick our cantle back. All right, so our glue's nice and set up. It's time to stick this cantle back. So we're gonna start thread around this inlay, doing the same thing like we had before, just creating a little bit of a bubble, but we don't wanna create too much of a wrinkle in here. So we're gonna isolate that bubble between our inlay and the top of our cantle. We're gonna push that bubble in. And we're just going to stick down this whole cantle. I'm going to tap right in here with a hammer just to help set that glue. Which is actually doing two things. It's helping getting rid of those tracks that the sewing machine left, and it's setting the glue. Now that all that's in place, we're going to take our cantle pliers and we're going to pinch around our cantle. You'll be able to feel the edge of the tree when you're pinching around the cantle. It'll just kind of fall into place where it's supposed to. Okay, then we're just going to clean up that line with the cantle pliers. We're just going to pinch and push it across, just like that. So now that everything's stuck down, we're going to leave this drawn down overnight, and the next step would be to do a cantle binding, but that's going to be in a different course, so make sure you find that on a loom. And we'd love to see your progress on a seat and inlay, and thanks for watching.